Imagine a massive clock, its hands ticking down, not just to any date, but specifically to July 9th.
Hmm.
For some, maybe it's Liberation Day, a moment of relief. But for a lot of nations, it feels more like a deadline packed with tension.
Absolutely, a real pressure point.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into what's been happening with the U.S. reciprocal tariff policy. We want to unpack what this looming deadline really means.
Yeah, what's at stake for different countries?
Exactly. And maybe get a sense of the strategy behind this, well, this high-pressure approach to trade talks.
It really all stems from that policy introduced back in early 2025, the reciprocal tariffs.
Right, that started with a 10% baseline on almost everything coming in.
Correct. But then remember, on April 9th, they hit pause for 90 days for most countries.
Ah, yes, the negotiation window.
Precisely. And that window is slamming shut for many on July 9th. If there aren't bilateral deals in place, well, we could see a snapback.
The snapback to much higher rates, I gather.
Much, much higher rates. That's the core implication of this July 9th deadline.
Okay, so snapback. What does that actually mean when the clock strikes, say, 12:01 a.m. on July 9th? Is it immediate?
It is. That's what's striking. For most countries involved, that 90-day pause ends exactly at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. It's not, a suggestion.
No wiggle room.
None implied. If a bilateral deal isn't signed, sealed, delivered, the duties are set to automatically jump back to those higher rates announced back on April 2nd.
And we're not talking small increases here, are we? Give us a sense of the scale. What could some countries face?
We're talking pretty eye-watering figures. Look at Vietnam, they could face a jump to 46%.
Wow, 46%.
Yeah. India, who we'll definitely talk more about, is looking at maybe 26%. Japan, Malaysia, potentially 24%.
The EU, I heard big numbers were being thrown around there too.
Indeed. The EU has faced threats of 20% or even a huge 50% tariff on certain imports. These are game-changing numbers for importers and exporters.
So this 90-day pause, it wasn't exactly a friendly timeout then? It sounds more like a tactic. What was the U.S. trying to achieve strategically?
That's the key question, isn't it? Why this intense short fuse? The pause itself is, well, it's a strategic tool designed to exert maximum leverage.
A take it or leave it kind of deal.
Essentially, yes. The goal seems to be getting immediate concessions, forcing compliance, rather than the usual, sometimes years-long trade negotiations.
Like the 18-month marathons we sometimes see.
Exactly. Now, the U.S. Treasury has indicated talks are ongoing with about 18 partners, and they've hinted that countries negotiating in good faith might get extensions.
Might.
But you have to remember, this administration has shown it's willing to implement tariff changes practically overnight. So even that potential extension is a form of pressure.
That's a lot of uncertainty. And aren't there legal fights and even Congress pushing back, sort of muddying the waters further?
Oh, absolutely. That's a critical layer here. You've got federal courts who've actually ruled that some of these tariffs imposed under the IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act.
Which is usually for sanctions, right? Not broad trade stuff.
Precisely. The courts said using IEPA like this was unlawful, that it exceeded presidential authority. But, and this is the crucial part, those rulings are stayed. They're on hold pending appeal.
So the tariffs are still active.
They remain in force for now. Oral arguments on the appeal are set for July 31st. Plus, you have bipartisan pushback in Congress. Senators introduced a bill just on June 17th trying to limit this presidential authority, citing the economic disruption.
So for you, the listener, trying to run a business or just understand the economy, this sounds like chaos.
It creates massive headaches. Businesses are forced into costly planning. Think about front-loading imports, rushing goods in now, tying up capital and inventory just to beat a potential tariff hike.
Or just putting off big decisions.
Exactly, deferring investments. It creates this drag, this economic burden just from the uncertainty, regardless of whether the tariffs ultimately stick legally. It hits supply chains, and eventually it can hit consumer prices.
Okay, so with all this pressure, who's actually navigating this? Has anyone managed to cut a deal? And who's struggling as the clock ticks?
Well, the clearest frontrunner is the United Kingdom. They're actually the only country so far with a formal trade deal signed on paper by the deadline.
Really? Only one?
The only one. It means their 10% reciprocal tariff stays as is for most things. Now, those existing 25% steel duties, That's still an unresolved pain point, as they say.
Yeah.
But, importantly, the UK is uniquely exempt from a potential broader increase to 50% on steel. That was framed as a relatively easy win in these negotiations.
Interesting. What about China? They're always a huge factor. Are they part of this July 9th scramble, or are they on a different schedule?
China's on a separate track. Their deadline got pushed back to August 12th.
Good.
And they actually reached a framework agreement back on Juneteenth in London, though it still needs final approval. Under that, U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods dropped significantly from 145% down to 30%.
Wow, from 145%.
Huge drop. And China lowered its tariffs on U.S. imports to 10%, down from 125%. But remember, China's situation is complex. There are other layers, like an extra 20% tariff related to fentanyl, plus the existing 25% Section 301 tariffs.
Right, the ones targeting specific trade practices.
Exactly. China's approach through all this seems to have been one of strategic patience. Some analysis suggests Beijing felt they sort of outlasted the U.S. during the big trade conflict.
Okay, fascinating. Now, Vietnam, you mentioned they faced a potential 46% hike. How are they doing? They seemed quite proactive.
They really have been. Reports suggest they're close to a framework deal. They're pushing hard to get that tariff down into the 20-25% range rather than the full 46%.
And they've offered things in return.
Oh, yeah. Significant concessions, a U.S. $4.15 billion energy deal, for instance, plus offers to cut their own tariffs on things like U.S. agricultural machinery, medical devices, even Boeing aircraft.
They really don't want that 46%.
It highlights their vulnerability, you know? They rely heavily on exports, maybe more so than economies like India or Japan. There's also that added complication, the U.S. allegation that Vietnam is used to transship Chinese goods.
Right, rerouting things to avoid tariffs. What about Malaysia and Switzerland? Quickly, where do they stand?
Malaysia's aiming to wrap things up by July 8th to dodge a 24% tariff. Their big focus is protecting their tech sector, semiconductors, electronics. They've also committed not to retaliate, which is notable.
Signaling they want a deal?
Seems so. Switzerland faces a potential 31%. They've sketched out a possible compromise, maybe easing access for some U.S. farm products. But their situation's tricky. They just got added to the U.S. Treasury's currency monitoring list.
Meaning the U.S. thinks they might be manipulating their currency.
That's the implication. Plus, their central bank just cut rates because the Swiss franc got so strong. So, lots of moving parts for them.
Okay, let's really zoom in now on India. This negotiation sounds particularly intense, almost like a showdown. What are the main sticking points between India and the U.S. right now?
It is really interesting, almost a clash of fundamental priorities. India is very firmly resisting U.S. demands to open up its markets for wheat, dairy, and corn.
Especially genetically modified crops, right?
Right.
That's a big issue for the U.S. side.
That's a key push from the U.S., yes. And India is saying no. On the flip side, India wants a full exemption from these reciprocal tariffs, and they want the existing 50% duties on their steel and aluminum removed.
So it's basically, you drop steel aluminum tariffs, we might talk concessions, but not on our core agriculture.
That seems to be the gist. India is drawing a hard line around agriculture and dairy.
Why such strong resistance there? What makes those sectors so sensitive for India?
It really boils down to domestic politics and economics. These sectors employ millions of people in India.
Very politically sensitive.
Hugely. The government feels opening them up suddenly to, say, U.S. genetically modified crops or large-scale dairy imports could destabilize things, hurt livelihoods. They often say national interest is supreme, and protecting these sectors falls squarely under that. They'd rather exclude them from this phase if needed.
Okay, so if they're saying no on those key U.S. demands, what is India putting on the table? What are they offering to get the U.S. to ease up on tariffs?
Well, they are offering some things. Lower tariffs on high-value U.S. goods like almonds, pistachios, walnuts, things that don't compete as directly with their main farm sectors.
Okay, luxury or niche goods.
Right. And they've also offered to tackle non-tariff barriers, things like customs rules, maybe streamline processes. They see this as part of a first phase of a larger bilateral trade agreement, or BTA, hopefully coming by the autumn.
So showing some goodwill, but on their terms.
Exactly. They're signaling willingness to engage, but not on the core agricultural demands right now.
Now, this stance India is taking.
Yeah.
We've heard reports they're not desperate to get a deal done by July 9th. That sounds risky, given the potential tariff hike to 26%. Why aren't they more panicked?
It's a fascinating strategy, isn't it? And likely a calculated one. A senior trade source in India basically said, look, even if we miss the deadline, what happens? Tariffs go back to April levels.
Implying they can handle it.
Implying they think they can weather it, perhaps. The thinking seems to be we might lose in some areas, gain in others. And they also stress they're the only country negotiating so elaborately for a full trade deal right now.
So projecting strength, maybe? Or setting a precedent?
Could be both. It's a bold stance. They're prioritizing that national interest, especially on agriculture, over meeting this specific deadline. It's a signal, perhaps, that they won't be rushed on core issues.
But let's be clear, if they do miss the deadline, what are the immediate consequences? What hit would the Indian economy take?
The immediate hit is that duty rate jumping from the current 10% baseline up to 26%. That's substantial. Plus, those existing 50% duties on steel and aluminum would stay put. It would definitely impact their exporters.
So it's not without cost, even if they're playing the long game.
Not at all. There are real economic consequences to missing the deadline.
Despite these current tensions and the not desperate talk, there is a bigger picture here for India-U.S. trade, right? A longer-term goal.
Absolutely. We need to remember President Trump and Prime Minister Modi agreed back in February to finalize a proper bilateral trade agreement by autumn 2025.
And didn't they have a huge target for overall trade?
They did. The goal was to more than double bilateral trade to $500 billion by 2030. That's a massive ambition.
So this current negotiation, this mini deal maybe, fits into that much larger strategic plan.
Precisely. These immediate talks, stressful as they are happening within that broader context. In fact, an Indian delegation is expected in Washington soon to keep working on both the immediate issues and that first part of the bigger BTA.
Okay, let's quickly round up some of the others who seem to be struggling to meet this deadline. The European Union sounds like it's in a particularly tough spot.
Yeah, the EU negotiations seem largely stalled. President Trump has floated that potential 50% tariff, which is a huge threat.
And the EU isn't just rolling over.
Definitely not. They view the U.S. tariffs as unjustified. They're actively preparing for escalation, planning their own 25% retaliatory tariffs on things like U.S. whiskey and soybeans if the 50% threat becomes real.
So bracing for impact, essentially.
They seem somewhat resigned to maybe keeping the 10% tariff, but they are pushing for an extension to keep talking. It's a real standoff.
What about Japan, usually a close U.S. ally and trading partner? What's the holdup there?
Japan faces a potential 24% reciprocal tariff, plus that significant 25% threat specifically on autos, which is huge for them.
Autos are key.
Absolutely. And Japan has been quite blunt, saying they're not focusing on the July deadline. Talks are described as being in a fog. It really seems the U.S. auto tariff threat is the main barrier.
Any domestic factors?
Yes, they have domestic elections coming up on July 20th. That makes it very difficult politically to offer concessions on sensitive areas like agriculture imports.
Okay, and just quickly, any word on South Korea, Thailand, Canada, or Mexico?
South Korea hasn't made much progress, faces a possible 25% tariff risk, which would hurt their export-heavy economy. Thailand started talks late, facing a potential 36% rate, but they've submitted proposals trying to get back down to the 10% baseline.
And Canada and Mexico, less tied to this specific deadline.
Their issues seem a bit different. Mexico has ongoing talks about things like steel caps and the broader USMCA trade agreement review. Canada's discussions involve border issues, fentanyl, things beyond just this reciprocal tariff push. So related but distinct challenges for them.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive.
Yeah.
Wow. It's an incredibly complex, fast-moving, global trade picture right now.
Yeah.
It almost feels like a giant high-stakes negotiation game.
It really does. That July 9th deadline has acted like a massive pressure cooker, forcing countries into these bilateral talks under the shadow of pretty punitive tariffs.
And we've seen the whole spectrum of responses, haven't we? From the UK getting a deal done to, well, India digging in its heels.
Exactly. Some showing their cards, others bluffing, maybe. It's intense diplomacy under the gun.
And for you, the listener, it's crucial to grasp that this isn't just abstract policy. These trade moves have real-world effects. We're talking impacts on global supply chains you rely on. Potential consumer price increases, projections are around 3-5% maybe,
Right.
and even potentially shaving points off GDP growth. We could see maybe a 0.6 percentage point reduction for the U.S. in 2025, according to some forecasts.
It connects directly to how nations manage political pressure, protect their own industries, and ultimately how global commerce gets reshaped. We all feel the ripples eventually.
So as we watch this intense period, this tariff tightrope walking, maybe the provocative thought to leave you with is this. What does this signal for the future?
Yeah, is this assertive, bilateral, high-pressure approach the new normal? Could it lead to a more fragmented global trading system, more uncertainty for everyone?
Or will this period eventually lead back to wanting broader, more stable, maybe multilateral agreements?
That's the big question hanging over all of this, and the answer will definitely keep unfolding long after July 9th comes and goes.